And so I wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2003 celebrating the rise of what I called apatheism, a joke, apathy and theism. But it said, isn't it great that we're becoming so secular that people don't even care about religion anymore? They're not even arguing about it. And that's fine because we'll all become Scandinavia and we'll get along better. Though religion causes conflict and dogma and ignorance. We'll all be better off without it. Yippee. Well, that was by actual count the dumbest thing I ever wrote.
Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. A year or two ago, I was on the campus of Brigham Young University and was having a bit of a personal crisis. And that is, I realized just how addicted I am to one substance, and that substance is caffeine. And there with our Latter-day Saint friends, there was lots of water, lots of lemonade, no caffeine. So I found myself approaching my friend John Rauch, liberal, Jewish, atheist, Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institution, to whisper, "Do you have a car?" And he said, "No, why?" And I said, "I have to get out of here to get some coffee, but I don't want to be less than polite and ask for that." And so since then, at every occasion that I have seen Jonathan Rauch in person, he has shown up with a cup of coffee to feed my addiction. And I'm happy to say that today we will be talking about the cup of coffee he is giving to American Christianity in a wake-up call called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan Rauch, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Russell. I think I arranged to get you that coffee that day, didn't I?
I think you did. And then a group of Southern Baptist church planters spirited me off campus and got me plenty of it. So,
can I just share before we start my recollection of how we met?
Okay.
Would that be out of line?
No.
So you and I were on opposite sides, very opposite sides of the debate over same-sex marriage.
Right.
And you were at what is it called? The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission?
Yes.
At the Southern Baptist Convention. And I became aware of you as a voice who, although on the other side, was a person of rare integrity. And I was so flattered because one day, out of nowhere, you came to Washington and you said you'd like to see me. And we had coffee together in the basement of a Panera Bread and bonded over what we do have in common, which is a commitment to religious liberty as a founding principle. And then the rest of your career unfolded as it did. Well, I was not surprised at your remarkable integrity and strength.
Well, that's kind. John and I get together every Thursday with a group of friends, and it's an unplanned, unscripted sort of time. We never know what we're going to be talking about until we get there. Maybe, John, you do, and you have it as some secret way of nudging us in the direction you want to go, but it seems very organic, and we talk about just a range of things.
It's not scripted, but I would like all of the audience to know that this book would not have happened without all that I have learned from talking to you, from your book, from others, including Pete Wehner and David French. But Russell Moore has been my teacher in leading me through a deeper understanding of Christianity and its relationship to our society and to our democracy, and especially to me, a non-Christian.
Well, that's kind. I was reading the other day a book from sometime maybe in the early 2000s by a group of kind of new age psychedelic enthusiasts, very, very quirky group of people. And one of them was predicting the end of the world and said, I think the end of the world is going to happen at the winter solstice of 2012, which he said coincides with the Mayan calendar of apocalypse. But he said, I think the end of the world will happen and we won't notice it. It will just be that everything will kind of go into a weird sort of alternate reality. And it's kind of like taking one of those ghost tours where you're like, I know this isn't really real, but it's creepy because it seems that winter solstice of 2012 did change almost everything in American life. And your book talks about a key part of this. And we do a segment on this show called Tell Me Where I'm Wrong. In some ways, at least the beginning of this book is let me tell you where I was wrong, because you have a really moving dedication to your college roommate. And what did you learn from him?
Well, his name was Mark McIntosh. I'm guessing some of your audience will be familiar with Mark. He was a doctor reverend, a Episcopal Church scholar and priest, wrote many, many books. But before he did all that, we were thrown together as roommates at Yale. I was someone who was never able to believe in God, even though at one point I tried, and I was gay. Though I didn't know it at that point, I did know that the church persecuted atheists and people like me. And of course, I'm Jewish as well. And I had grown up thinking that Christianity was cruel and hypocritical. And Mark was a devout Christian and the first Christian I ever met who I could see not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. He was Jesus-like and thought about that and exemplified that. So he began a long journey of trying to understand Christianity better, but still by 20 or so years ago, I was still a very secular oriented person. And so I wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2003. What is that? It's almost 22 years ago now, celebrating the rise of what I called apatheism, a joke, apathy and theism. But it said, isn't it great that we're becoming so secular that people don't even care about religion anymore? They're not even arguing about it. And that's fine because we'll all become Scandinavia and we'll get along better. Though religion causes conflict and dogma and ignorance, we'll all be better off without it. Yippee. Well, that was by actual count the dumbest thing I ever wrote. It was dead wrong. The things that have happened since 2003, we've seen a dramatic decline, as you and your listeners know, in Christian belief, the rise of nuns, people unaffiliated, people who say they have no religion, the rise of loneliness and despair, and the rise of substitute religions, including politics and MAGA, all of which have made society fiercer, more polarized, and none of which these substitute religions can actually ground people in a higher doctrine that transcends everyday life and politics. And so I was 180 degrees wrong, and this book is my apology.
I think that sense that you had then in 2003 is one that was shared across the spectrum and reacted to in different ways. What you saw as kind of and cultural inevitability towards Scandinavia as a positive thing, religiously speaking. I remember election night 2012. It's one of the reasons I think that the 2012 language struck me in that book. And I was dean of a seminary, and I had an election night event where students could come and watch the election results. And so there were, maybe 1,000 students there watching the results. And I was stunned by how many of them were utterly shocked And, the election was close. The polls were close, but they weren't, it wasn't a shock that Barack Obama won re-election, at least to me. And I realized that a lot of them were consuming media saying two things. One is, we're going to win. And you're the majority of people think the way you do. And the other is, if you don't, it's absolute catastrophe, and there's no coming back from it. And so I think this sense of an inevitable move toward secularism accelerated some of the sense of frenzy and desperation that some people had to say, we've got to do whatever it takes to prevent this from happening. You talk about in the book how you think that you took for granted liberal democracy, Christianity, all of those sorts of things as having a kind of, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but a kind of stability and an anti-fragility that we've seen not to be the case. Is that a fair summation of it?
Yes, that's very fair. I mean, I grew up in a world, I was born in 1960. I'm 64 and a half. I grew up in a world where the first thing people asked about you was not what do you do for a living or where did you go to college or where are you from, but what church do you belong to?
Hmm.
It was just a given that these were fundamentals of society. And I was just this morning looking at some Gallup numbers. Church membership in the United States was about 70% from 1940 to 2000. It went up and down a little bit, but it was around two-thirds to 70% of the public. And we all took that for granted, not so much the religious aspect, but we just thought that a lot of the stability that we had as a country and a democracy, the sense of who we are as people and where we get our values and how we build our communities, that was just kind of baked in. It was the water we swam in. Since 2000, in the next 20 years, church membership dropped to below 50%, which is, I mean, astounding when you think about that happening in only 20 years. And so suddenly, it's not that church is always great. Believe me, I'm gay. I can give you chapter and verse on all the hate that went on in some churches. But it turned out that what we were taking for granted was all of the work that those churches were doing to build community bonds, to give people a place every Sunday where they met and worshiped together, to teach higher values, to transmit those values to young people. These are all things that the founders of our country relied on religion to do. Now, they were not all by any means what we would call evangelicals today. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Washington was an Anglican, an Episcopal. But they told us, we know because they told us that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence rely on underpinning values like truthfulness and honesty and civility that are not taught by the Constitution itself. They come from somewhere else. And where they said they come from is civil society and religion. And I forgot that. That's my great sin.
Why do you think that happened so quickly, the loss of church membership?
You tell me, Russell. You've been living it. I'll tell you what I think, but I took this mostly from you. Uh, so we saw two big waves. The first was the collapse of the mainline churches, and that
Mhm.
starts in the 70s. And then everybody in the evangelical world, the white evangelical Protestants get really smug because they're picking up a lot of members and they're saying, see, people want a harder, fiercer religion. They want it to be firm and rooted in scripture. And so they're doing great. And then the second wave comes. And that's since, roughly, it's actually this century. And then the evangelical church starts to decline. The Southern Baptist Church begins hemorrhaging members until today, according to Pew, the numbers of white evangelicals are as small as the number of white mainliners, about 13%. And my guess is that the same thing happened to both churches. It just happened first to one and then the other, and that's secularization. For different reasons, both of these churches lost their identity as something separate from the surrounding culture. The mainline churches did it by devoting themselves more to the social gospel and social reform and kind of losing track of scripture. And then I think evangelicals did it in the opposite direction by diving headfirst into the world of politics and culture wars and turning that into almost a substitute religion. But you tell me, is that right?
I
Is
think
that
I
this?
think that that's a big part of it. I wonder though how much also is related to a more generalized collapse of institutional trust and belonging. I mean, if we look around right now at almost every institution, I mean, I think of the press, for instance, and the loss of local community newspapers, and this kind of evisceration of institutional credibility or sense of trust and belonging in institutions, that has loomed large as well.
Well, of course, and these things interact, and the church is always going to be part of the underlying society. And since now 30, 40 or so years, institutions have been just under siege in the United States. First from the left, burn baby burn, never trust anyone over 30, and then the anti-institutionalism of the right has been even greater. But I would guess I would want to know, if would the church have been more resilient in the face of these attacks on institutions if they had been more countercultural?
Yes, definitely. I think that's definitely the case. I also think that one of the things that has surprised me, over the past sweep of the past 20 years, for instance, is kind of the viewpoint that would have been assumed when you were writing the Apatheism article, would be that secularization and de-churching would happen corresponding with education and affluence. So that we would end up in a situation where most of the churches and people who are church members would be rural, lower class, and that sort of affluent, educated people would be out of the church. It's turned out, in terms of church members, it's exactly the opposite. That people who are more affluent and more educated are more likely to be members and active members in congregations and people in suburban areas than people in rural America. And people who are in, what we refer to right now as economic anxiety. That's something that really did surprise me.
Yes, and it's turning over time. If it continues, it kind of turns the church, religious participation, into a kind of gated community, a prize you get for having a lot of high social capital. So the same people who can send their kids to Princeton are also heavily involved in the church.
You talk about in cross purposes what you call sharp Christianity. So there's thin Christianity, sharp Christianity, thick Christianity. With the thin and the sharp, we'll talk about the thick a little bit later on. But what do you mean by that?
So sharp Christianity is what I've come to think of as the church of fear. And here is one area, Russell, where I have drawn so deeply on the well of your thinking and work. If there's one commandment that Christians have told me that the Bible and the church commands, it's be not afraid. It's that we are on this world temporarily and with a higher purpose and a higher meaning and a higher Lord. And that should inspire us not to go around in a state of fear, paranoia. We're about to lose everything. The next election is the last election. Christians are being driven out of the public square. My religion will soon be illegal. My kids will be forced through a sex change. But what we've seen instead of that attitude of be not afraid is an attitude much more like be very afraid. And we see this coming. Again, you can tell me, but what's different this time from previous bouts of politicization is this does not seem to be coming primarily from the pastorate. it seems to be coming more from the pews. It seems like what pastors say is happening is people are watching social media and the news, and they're deep in these foxholes and these silos and, cable news, and they're taking that to church, and they're saying in church, we're here for what one pastor I talked to called a battlefield mindset. We are here to fight the culture wars and to bring that to church. And then they bombard the pastor. If the pastor tells them, be like Jesus, I think you tell a story about some people who thought that when confronted with the gospel, they said, well, that doesn't sound Christian.
Yeah.
You can tell that story better than I can. So the church of fear becomes kind of the opposite of what Christians are meant to look to God to provide. And that has all kinds of ramifications, of course.
You were, as you said, working in areas of religious freedom with a liberal, small L, liberal democratic view of religious freedom and public pluralism. Where do you think American Christians really did have grounds to be afraid, and where did they not?
Well, I'm not sure I'd ever use the word afraid because I've
Or
always
concerned?
thought
Concerned
concerned. Yeah,
and maybe
concerned is better.
besieged.
Christians remain such a dominant force in the United States that I think this climate of fear was really just never justified. But concern, yeah, there is undoubtedly a wing of secular thinking which aggressively promotes secularism, does not welcome religion in the public square, is constantly on the watch for any hint that a prayer might be said in a school or a crucifix might turn up. There is a tradition of that in parts of America. There is also a real conflict. This is what I think you and I came together over initially. There is a real conflict between secular law in realms like anti-discrimination law and religious teaching. And that's, of course, the famous cake baker who doesn't want to bake the cake for the same-sex marriage. And the question of will anti-discrimination law force that person to do that? My view is that those conflicts can be and should be and often are worked out through the political process of negotiation and figuring out how to make room for each other. And we've been good at doing that for 250 years. And the cultivating this atmosphere of fear, turning the concern into fear, is what has made those compromises so difficult because people in the churches are being told, if you compromise at all, it's the 9/11 election. It's the apocalypse. So you can't compromise. You just have to feel embattled. And of course, that only makes it harder to make these accommodations.
I think part of the problem here, it's not most of the problem, but part of the problem is linguistic. And that is with the word compromise, because we will, in evangelical spaces, often talk about, I mean, there was a famous Keith Green album in the 70s, No Compromise. And that is the sense of not being a morally or spiritually compromised church, where you whittle away your beliefs and values in order to gain acceptance with whatever culture or subculture you're in. And I think there are a lot of people who think that that's what we mean when we talk about compromise in the civil arena, which is, of course, not saying that we're going to whittle down what we believe, but to say we're going to act cooperatively in stages sometimes, and nobody's ever going to get what he or she wants. I think that might be, at least for some people, the problem of understanding the difference between those two things became
That's
acute.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've written a bunch of stuff on compromise because it's become this kind of four-letter word. And what compromise is in the civil sphere is it's about finding creative solutions Compromise is a great thing when I come to you with a firm position and you come back with a different firm position. But if we're forced to compromise, which is what the Constitution is all set up to do, it's a compromise forcing device. We're not just going to split the difference usually. We're going to start thinking about, well, okay, maybe if we tried this other third thing, it's like if two kids on the playground, one wants to play volleyball and the other wants to play basketball, maybe they come up with a third game. Maybe they make something up. Compromise is a creative force that actually designs new solutions, brings in new ideas, new voices. It's the great dynamic engine of social creativity. It's not a bad thing. Now, it doesn't require that you back down on your key principles. It just does require that you work with other people to share the country.
One of the things I've noticed here in Nashville, where I live, we have tons of people who have moved in from New York and California. A lot of people over the past several years. And many of them are doing so because they do feel besieged. And I'm not just talking about kind of sharp Christian, sort of Christian nationalists or post liberals, at least not starting out that way. But for most of them, inevitably what they talk about right away, whether religious or non-religious, is schools. And to say, as one person who moved here from Manhattan said, who's not in any way kind of a culture warrior, but said, my daughter couldn't have friends because everything was so classified in terms of sexual identity within the school that any kind of friendship had to have a define the relationship, what are we kind of conversation. And it was just so heavy handed that we didn't see a way that we could even exist in that kind of place. If you think about the way over the past several years, a lot of the kind of culture war backlash does come down to schools. What do you think is going on there?
Well, again, you're probably more of an authority on this than I am, but I have friends with kids in the California public schools, and don't get me started. The California public schools have embraced some pretty strange ideological stuff. I am hoping that that process of self-correction is underway. The parents don't like it. It is not scientifically accurate. This is the race, but especially the gender stuff that they're teaching, dividing people up in certain ways. But first of all, that's not the whole country. And second of all, we see a national school choice movement came out of Arizona, but like lots of states now, especially red states, are giving kids what are called backpack vouchers. And that's designed to address this problem. And third, maybe more important, I think the retrenchment is already starting to happen. I think a lot of people have looked around and said these kinds of things went too far.
Do you think that the school choice movement is the way to go? I think about even in some red states, Kentucky, for instance, had a vote on this. And there's concern that once you move out of theory when it comes to vouchers and move into reality, that you end up defunding school systems with, for instance, programs for students with disabilities and learning disabilities and otherwise. And in many communities, if you look at for instance, the Kentucky results, a lot of this was due to rural communities where they were saying the public school actually is maybe the only functioning institution that we have left. Do you think that the kind of school choice backlash to some of this might end up taking us to and actually a more fragmented, lonely sort of place?
Well, sure. There's the problem with education reform is it's just a series of trade-offs, right? I have been a supporter of school choice movement since the 90s. I'm not a dogmatic supporter. There are way better and worse ways to do it, and the literature on the outcomes is very mixed. But I do feel like in a lot of places where underprivileged kids are caught in schools and getting a terrible education, that these are schools where wealthier let's be honest, wealthier white people would not dream of sending their kids. So they left long ago. And it just always seemed to me as a matter of fairness that being for parents to be able to choose schools for their kids is something that all Americans should be able to enjoy. That said, from what little I know, I'm a fan of the charter school movement. This is off subject for this show, but people who really do know about education say that after a kind of shaky start in the 90s, the charter school movement has really found its legs. And these are schools that work, they are within the public school system, but they are run separately and independently from the normal school board schools. So they can devise their own curriculum and submit that for approval. And that's showing some real success in places across the country. So that's also something I would look at.
I laughed as I was reading your book because you didn't put it this way, but this is sort of the way I classified it as I was reading it. Your section on illiberalism and post-liberalism, it kind of hit me as I was reading those sections together that it's kind of like that old Simpsons episode where there's a Protestant heaven and a Catholic heaven, and the Catholic heaven is loud and boisterous and so forth, and the Protestant heaven is very reverent and very quiet. That you almost have Catholic and evangelical forms of illiberalism bringing the DNA of their respective movements into that kind of illiberalism. So you're describing, for instance, this surge of Catholic integralism and post-liberalism as being very erudite but vague. And so you talk about in the book how when you actually get to the question of, okay, but what are you going to do about um, Jews, for instance? Those sorts of questions. I think it becomes
Yeah,
very
little
vague
things
and
like
nothing.
that.
Yeah, little things like that are not answered at all, and they're just sort of left at the category of vagueness, which seems almost to fit the stereotype of Jesuits. There's a plan, but we're not going to tell you what the plan is. You're not ready for the plan yet. Whereas with the evangelical Christian nationalism, you have an account in the book which I had never seen or heard of before, but it immediately made sense of one Christian nationalist talking about to a group supporting Egyptian authoritarianism because it's keeping down the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hungarian illiberalism with Orban and others, these sorts of movements, followed by a QR code where people can buy materials in order to, and it seemed to be that fit into
And a
kind of
bulk discount, a bulk
the
discount.
perfect stereotype and a bulk discount of sort of evangelical entrepreneurialism and populism joining together. When you look at some, I mean, if you look at the Catholic illiberal stuff, you're right. It's mostly kind of vague theory, and nobody really wants to talk about how you could actually implement something like this in the United States of America. And when you look at the evangelical post-liberal Christian nationalists, it's very specific and completely ridiculous in terms of even if you supported it constitutionally and morally. No way. So you can have evangelical theobros sitting around and talking about whether or not Muslims will be allowed to be Muslims publicly, and licenses for Jews to be able to have their synagogues, but not here and here. I mean, things that are just not ever going to happen in 2025 America. Um, where do you think this illiberalism is going to go? Do you think that it crashes up against its lack of practicality and utopianism, or is it the beginning wave of something really dangerous?
We're seeing a worldwide wave of illiberalism and anti-liberalism, Russell, and it's very dangerous indeed. As best I can tell, it is not driven by Christianity per se. And one of the things that scholars find when they look at so-called Christian nationalism, these are the movements to put Christians or self-declared Christians in power, is that they're not really Christian at all. They're more like pagan, actually. They don't know the Bible or scripture. They don't really care about the teachings of Jesus. They don't especially care about the church, but they're using the church and Christian symbolism and Christian civilization as an idea, as kind of battering rams to take power. And yes, we are seeing that all over the world. And it is one of the forces that is weakening commitment on the right in countries around the world to liberal democracy. Part of the reason that in the book I go after post-liberalism, and glad to hear make you laugh a little, is that crazy theories aside, post-liberalism has done this, I think, this really good hat trick of saying, you secular liberals, the Jonathan Rauches of the world, you guys are responsible for the decline of family, faith, nationalism in the good sense, commitment, patriotism, commitment to country. And especially you're responsible for the decline of the church because your secular liberalism it's like an acid that eats away anything you put it in. And it's undermining all the values of civilization. And that's a really good trick because I think what it's doing is telling us that we're to blame for the church's failure to do its job. I mean, the Madison and Adams and Hamilton, all of the others were very explicit. They said, we, secular liberalism, cannot do the job all by itself. It needs the support of civil society and it must have the support of religion. And it said, we're not giving you transcendent values. We're just giving you a public process so that people can go about their free lives, forming their associations and their churches and find their transcendent values. They said, go to church for that. And now the churches, which are supposed to be doing that, are saying it's our fault that they're not doing their job. I hope I'm not putting that too strongly or in a way that's offensive, but it's just been a really good trick. And one of the things I want to do in this book is tell my Christian friends, I know this will sound presumptuous, but tell my Christian friends, if you want to know why faith in America is collapsing, why people are abandoning the church, many people are becoming nuns or picking up strange religions like Soul Cycle or Wicca or MAGA or politics, maybe, just maybe you guys should look in the mirror and look at what you're teaching and look at what's happening in the churches and their politicization and their secularization. And I think you've even used the word paganization. Don't you think maybe that's part of the problem?
You mention in the book this idea of a thick kind of religion, and you point to what you see might be some models of a kind of alignment. You use this language of not an alliance, but an alignment between democracy and religion in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Why do you think that is? What's going on there? And what makes the LDS experience different from what we see in religion writ large across the country? I could see the argument coming from two completely contradictory places as to why that is. And I wonder which one you think it is. Some people might say, well, if you think about Latter-day Saints, Utah, Idaho, parts of Arizona, there are overwhelming majorities of Latter-day Saints. It's very homogenous culturally in terms of, I talked to evangelicals in Utah. They will say it's just everything is culturally LDS, regardless of, and you kind of can't overestimate how dominant that is. Or I could see the argument being, well, Latter-day Saints are a minority religion in the United States. not in Utah, but in the United States, always have been and have been at times a persecuted religious minority, and that affects the way they see themselves in the country. Which of those two things do you think is more important there?
I think it's much more the latter. It is true that the church is very politically important in Utah, but the work that they've been doing, for example, the Respect for Marriage Act, a landmark law that the church, along with some evangelical groups, actually, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the Orthodox Union, a Jewish conservative group, helped to pass. All of those were factions that are not majority factions, but they were working together in concert behind an idea. So I don't think it's the majority aspect. I think it's the fact that their church was born out of persecution and to this day still has an exile. I guess it's called exilic mindset. The mindset, by the way, I think of the original Christian church. And a mindset that when I went to Salt Lake City and spent a week out there and talked to church elders, I felt very at home there as an American Jew because of that diaspora quality. Salt Lake City is not the homeland of the church. They're in exile in Salt Lake City. And so I think that, and they will tell you that exilic experience has given them a sensitivity toward the need to get along with others. But beyond the sensitivity, they approach patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation as a mission, as part of what God put them on this planet to do. And in that sense, they are like the original Christians who were not about becoming a majority, becoming powerful, becoming strong in this world, but about the mission work of healing. And Jews have that mindset too. We have the phrase tikkun olam, to heal the world. So I think it's much more about the nature of the church and how it's fit in.
I think sociologically, there's two things going on. I mean, obviously, I would have deep and important theological differences with the LDS Church, but sociologically, when I look at it, I think there are two parts to it, and one of them is the one you just articulated, which is that sense of the ongoing experience of being a minority in a pluralistic culture. But the second part, I think, is a sense of security that I think is related primarily to the cohesiveness of LDS internal culture. And that, I think, is largely anchored in the rites of passage and service that come along with the expectation of a 2-year mission experience. And so you have, when I look at some of the fear and frenzy that's taking place in other religious groups, including in evangelicalism, a lot of it has to do with this underlying anxiety we're going to lose our children. And sometimes that it's kind of like Jonathan Haidt talks about the anxiety of parents over their kids being abducted leads to this kind of helicoptering, which actually leads to anxiety. So people have things to be afraid of, but they're afraid of the wrong things, and they accelerate those things. I think there's less of that in an LDS culture because they do have um, uh, the sense of an ability to enculturate the next generation in service in
So
a
if I
way
could,
that
can
in
I?
a lot of
Yeah.
other religious institutions that's lost.
Well, the key words there are has lost. Um, so yeah, building on
Yeah.
that, we use this phrase, which maybe we should explain: thick religion, thick Christianity. What do I mean? What do we mean by thick? A thick religion is one that asks a lot of its followers and gives a lot back in return. So it stands apart from the general cultural society. It's not just a consumer good. Um, it's doing a lot for you and it's doing a lot with you and it's really in your life. And of course, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is, by those standards, a thick religion. I was amazed at the many layers of social technology that they use starting from early childhood, but there's teaching inside the family. There is what's called um, seminary, which is a kind of an after-school program or a before-school program. There's an institute program. There's mission, though only 30 or 40%. I couldn't get an exact number. They didn't want to say, but they say it's like 40% go on mission. A lot of people don't. But then as adults, the church has all kinds of ways of including you. And you'll get a call from elders in the church if you disappear, or if you seem depressed, or if something's wrong, someone will come to you. So those are not technologies that are specific to the doctrines of Joseph Smith and that particular church. They're things that Christians used to be very good at and used to provide, and still could, I think, if they were a little bit less oriented. Well, maybe I'm being unfair, but maybe if they were a little less oriented to politics and a little bit more oriented toward the next world, maybe that would be easier for them to do.
How would you explain because I've seen a similar phenomenon happen in mirror image sorts of communities. So, for instance, you can go to, say, a conservative evangelical conference. If you talk about pluralism and small L liberalism, someone might say, well, how can you have compromise with people who don't want you to exist? And then I will talk to progressive friends of ours who maybe work at a think tank or an activist organization. And they will say, when they talk about small L liberalism, that they're immediately going to hear from their Gen Z staffers saying, how can I have compromise with someone who doesn't think I should exist? So it's kind of like when you and I met at Panera Bread the first time, you could have said, how am I going to sit and have a conversation with someone who doesn't think that my marriage should have happened? I mean, and I could have said, how am I supposed to have a conversation with someone who thinks that apathy toward religion is the way we should go and become Scandinavia? I mean, how do you help people to get beyond that sense of existential threat?
There's a secular answer, and then there's the Christian answer, which, of course, the latter you know far better than I. The secular answer is I am an evangelist for and a former board member of a group called Braver Angels, which is one of a lot of groups that is, it's a grassroots depolarization group, which is in which Americans reteach ourselves to get past these tropes about the other side being evil, so evil we can't even talk to them. These are structured conversations and debates in lots of ways that people relearn how to make contact and listen to each other. And the single most prevalent thing that people say when they participate in Braver Angels is we are not as divided as we've been led to believe. And that is, in fact, true. All of the survey evidence shows that people have a grossly exaggerated, like 2x exaggerated idea of how different the beliefs are of the other side from their own and how extreme the other side is. But a lot of people don't know that because they're getting their information on Twitter and cable news. So what Braver Angels is doing, but there's lots of others. There's Bridge USA. There's tons of them now. I tell people, go do that. And if you still think, after spending some time in a structured conversation with people who believe things different, if you still think that they want you off the planet, come back and tell me about it, because no one else has ever said that, because it's not true. So that's the secular answer. Check out braverangels.org. The Christian answer is, of course, you're living in a world of people who are unbelieving, often outright hostile. Isn't that why Christianity was put on this planet? Isn't that the very nature of Jesus's ministry? Aren't Christians the very people who are supposed to speak out with love in a countercultural way? in a world that is hostile to them and maybe doesn't even want them to exist, maybe nailed them to crosses and fed them to lions. If Christians aren't able to say it's part of our reason for being to confront, not confront, to encounter people who feel very differently from us and who may not love us and who may not like us. If we're not doing that, what are we supposed to do? You tell me.
One time, you and Tim Keller and I were talking about some of these issues, and you used the analogy of it seems as though there's antennae that are picking up on a part of reality that I am not. I cannot see.
I
He,
meaning me, yeah.
yes, yes, and I wonder, would you describe yourself as a hard stop atheist or an agnostic?
Hard stop atheist.
Hard stop atheist. What do you think it would take for you to change your mind? What would you need to see or experience insofar as you know? I mean, obviously, we only know so much about what it would take for us to change our minds on anything.
It would require an account of God that you would not recognize as being God. It would require an account of God and God's action in the world that was as predictable and non-miraculous as everything else.
Hmm.
In which, if you believe that Jesus was resurrected 3 days after crucifixion, um, if you said that happened because of God, then I would need to know how God did it, and I would need to see the mechanism, and then I would want to say, okay, how can we reproduce God in a lab, and so forth. It's a whole different way of thinking. So yes, I can believe in God if God is like a magnetic field, but asking me to suspend all regularity in the universe, that is a bridge which I cannot cross. So that idea of God, of supernatural forces, that is something that I cannot reach within my framework. But that said, Russell, the first thing, the preface to your question is just as important. I'm not at all smug about my inability to receive the bandwidth of supernaturalism, because I can't because I can't. I did try when I was about 14, but I've known since the age of 5, at least, that I thought the idea of some big daddy in the sky working miracles and contemplating humans in this vast universe, and by the way, looking human and acting human, I thought that was silly. And I still think, I'm sorry that it's silly, but that's my loss, because it's pretty obvious to me that there is a dimensionality, a depth to the universe that spiritual folks can perceive and feel that I do not. Yet they are getting something from that that is not attainable to me. So the analogy I sometimes use is I'm a little bit like being colorblind. I get along fine. I like the way I am. I don't want to change it, but there are wavelengths that I don't receive that you do. And I think I'm actually the poorer for that. So I'm not going around saying everyone should be constituted the way I am. I'm just saying this is the personality and the psychology and the epistemology that I was given.
I remember Tim Keller saying to you that conversation, "Yeah, we're not going to give up on you so easily, John."
That's why we love you guys.
You dedicated the book partly to Tim.
Tim and Mark McIntosh. Yeah. Yeah. Two people who I've lost them both now. That's hard. But two people who have guided me into a little bit closer to your world. I feel like, I will never see the world the way you and Tim do. That richness escapes me. But I now feel, thanks to folks like you and Tim and Mark, that I'm like, have you ever been a passenger on a train, a fast moving train, and you're dozing off? You look out the window and something flashes by. Maybe it's a billboard, maybe it's a house, and you think, wow, did I just see that? But then by the time you turn around to look at it, you've gone around the bend, it's gone. I feel now I have that kind of view of your world. I can't see the whole thing. It's not in front of me. I can't contemplate it. I certainly can't live in it. But at moments I can sort of wake up and catch a fleeting glimpse of it and see, I think I have some idea what they're seeing.
I always benefit from conversation with you every time I have it, and this is no exception. The book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It is a really helpful and fascinating book for all of you listeners. I encourage you to check it out. Jonathan Rauch, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Russell.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.